So on the Kool-Aid Man, I was wondering if you could maybe steel man uh, the case for and against Elon Musk and Doge, because you mentioned all of these regulations, all of this complexities that get in the way of building. It seems like a bold human like Elon is required to break through the regulation. Put that on one side, and the other side, I read somewhere that abundance is kind of the anti-Doge.
Mm.
Uh, so, which to me, it seems like there is conflicting ideas, but there's also alignment. So maybe can we break all that?
I think the steel man is very easy to make here. Department of Government Efficiency. That sounds like an organization that's needed if government is inefficient. And one of the themes of our book is just how inefficient government can be. Not only at building houses, building energy, often at achieving its own ends. Building high-speed rail when it wants to build high-speed rail. Adding affordable housing units when it wants to add affordable housing units. I love Ezra's line that we don't just need to think about, deregulating the market. We need to think about deregulating government itself, getting the rules out of the way that keep government from achieving the democratic outcomes that it's trying to achieve. This is a world in which a Department of Government Efficiency is a godsend. We should be absolutely obsessed with making government work well, especially if we're going to be the kind of liberals who believe that government is important in the first place. So that, to me, is the sort of pillbox version of a steel case for a Department of Government Efficiency.
Wait, before you do the anti-case, can I offer a different steelman?
Please.
I think the steelman case for what Doge is, right, rather than what it pretended to be, is that the government is an interest. The bureaucracy, the deep state, the rules, the regulations, and it's not about efficiency. Never was. You wouldn't do this if it was about efficiency. That it's zero-based budgeting. That you're breaking the thing. You're turning it on and off. You're firing massive parts of it. Because the only way to make change within it possible is to delete what currently exists, whether it was efficient or not. You would never actually know. That if you had it all come and present its case for efficiency or something, you never know, you'd get turned around, whatever. That the only way, like the problem with the government is there is no actual competition. The Department of Education doesn't get outcompeted by the Agency of Education, which has started up, 3 years ago or something. And because of that, the only way to make possible radical change is to bulldoze the thing that currently exists. And then once that is done, you can begin to rebuild. You can, if you've fired half of the Department of Education, then you can start rehiring your people and they will actually do what you want. If you have shown that you can delete every regulation or just not follow it, then you can begin deciding which ones to actually follow. If there is no Department of USAID and you've moved it back under state, then you can tell state what really to fund in terms of foreign aid, right? There's a theory here, I think, that was never about efficiency. It was about deletion. He's not trying to make things run a little bit better. He's not trying to lower the overhead cost of government. That the theory is that in the first term, the bureaucracy impeded Donald Trump. It didn't listen to him. Bureaucracy is supposed to be limbs of the president. The only way to make the federal government a neural link of Donald Trump himself is to destroy the federal government and then rebuild it as that thing.
I think if you talk to people at DOGE or talk to people who are authors of Project 2025, who are at Heritage, who are chiefs of staff of the people working for Heritage, if you have a truth serum conversation with these folks and you say,
they'll
defend what's happening.
That's not a
just
they're excited to tell you.
This is what they're saying. They're saying something metastatic has grown inside of government. Not just over the last few years under Joe Biden, but over the last few decades, maybe going all the way back to FDR and even Woodrow Wilson. We have allowed an administrative state to accumulate like barnacles on a ship around the executive branch. And it's keeping the executive branch from being able to translate the democratic will into policy. Because there's never any president who is purely elected by the people. They're elected into an office that is already pre-contaminated by the bureaucracy itself. And we're trying to take all of that away. We're trying to, this is very just explicitly the case that they're going to make, trying to make government more democratic, not less, by allowing the democratic the elected president guide or lead in a pure way.
Okay, so as you said, two things. One is the steel man, and then at the end there was a non-steel man. So the first part is cutting, removing as much as possible to see what's actually needed. That seems like one of the ways to figure out what's actually needed is by removing it. And then there's the second thing is that you mentioned, so that you can install the people that follow your policy or whatever.
Oh, I disagree with you that wasn't the steel man. I mean, I think you have to listen to them to do the steel man, right? I don't think the steel man is imaginary. If you read the OMB regulation that froze funding, it said explicitly that the government has to reflect the will of the people as expressed through their choice of president. If you read anything Russ Vought has ever said, they have the unitary executive theory. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. If you ask me to do the non-steel man, which I would love to do too, it is not my view that the steel man case of this is to make the federal government fully responsive to Donald Trump. But the steelman case for what they are doing, as expressed by them, and I think like a steelman reflects I have talked to these people, right? Like I'm telling you what they tell me on some level. The steelman cases, they believe, like as Derek said a minute ago, this has become non-democratically responsive. And the way it becomes democratically responsive is deeply responsive to the president. The president represents a different politics than Joe Biden's politics. And so if you have a state filled with liberal civil servants who don't want to do what he says, that is a violation of small d democratic principles of how the government should be run. I think if you don't like it, that's fine. But I do want to say, I actually think that is the steel man. He's not, they're not doing this for no reason. They have an intention here. And I think, whether you like it or not sort of depends on whether or not you like their view.
Okay, well, I don't like it because it cuts my ear in a certain way. That one of the criticisms I have for Donald Trump and the Trump administration is there's a natural circles of sycophancy that forms, and every president has their personality and psychological quirks, and I think he's one of the people where favoritism is more likely to develop. So when you choose who to install as the head of whatever organization, so if you fire everybody and rehire, the rehiring process is more likely to have people that just said nice things about Donald Trump in the past versus a meritocracy-based system that these people are really good.
Lex, AOC should definitely come on the show.
Well, she has her own. But the ideal, the steel man to me, about not maybe what Elon is doing, is in order to have the best people in the world doing a great job at every part of government, you have to figure out, his first email of what have you done this week? If we just steel man everything he's been doing, which is let's find the productive people that show up to work, that love what they're doing, that are actually sort of amazing at what they're doing. How would you solve that problem? From his experience in business, it's painful but effective to just fire almost everybody and then rebuild from there and continuously do that. And the result, as long as everybody's aligned in a mission, is you simplifying over and over the system so it's more and more and more effective. Now, how else would you approach we could start now criticizing how would you make government more efficient if not by the way that they're doing it?
Can I steel man to the other side now?
Sure.
Okay. You wouldn't do this. You wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
So let me say a couple things. One is that efficiency only makes sense when yoked to a goal. So if Elon Musk came in and did this at Tesla, Musk had a goal for Tesla. It was to build the electric vehicle of the future. SpaceX, he had a goal for SpaceX. We know what the goal for SpaceX is. In some long-term way, go to Mars, but in some short-term way, cheaper orbital travel, cheaper orbital shipping, reusable rockets, etc. We know what the goal for Solar City was. In a way, and I do think sort of the purchase of Twitter is late Elon, which becomes a much more political set of goals, but nevertheless, in a way, at least there's an expressed idea at Twitter, right, which is the return of free expression. I think it's really important if you are steel manning or any kind of manning, is really asking and like listening to what people are saying their goal is, because efficiency does not exist in a vacuum, right? A state that is efficient at building dirty energy and a state that is efficient at burning clean energy, they can be opposite versions of each other, right? You have to be optimizing towards something. You're an AI guy, you have to optimize towards something. And the goal, I find myself really consistently frustrated by conversations about Doge that treat efficiency as some free-floating thing. Or I sometimes will hear people say to me, very smart people have said to me, oh, what Doge is really doing is stripping the government down to studs so it can put AI into it, because Elon believes in AGI is coming soon and you need to make a government capable of using AGI. And I always say to them, okay, AI towards what? Towards what value function? Towards what prompt are you inserting at the base level? Sorry about that. And I think a few things become very clear. One is that it is towards Donald Trump. It is his movement. Elon Musk serves at his pleasure. Elon Musk has said that he would like to himself chisel Donald Trump's face into Mount Rushmore. He said he loves Donald Trump as much as a man can love any other man. He believes in Trump, right? I think you have to take him at his word. Or maybe you think he's very cynical and he's saying all that to curry favor in a sycophantic way with Trump. But at some point, Elon Musk does not serve with any kind of independence. If Trump says your power is gone, his power is gone. He's functionally an outside advisor to the government. So then you really do, I think, have to listen to what Donald Trump has said, what Russ Vought has said. And they believe that Trump represents something fundamental. His movement represents something fundamental that has been suppressed in American life. Okay. I think if you were doing something, the best cases I've seen for Elon are a zero-based budgeting case. You're trying to break everything down to studs, and then it needs to re-justify itself. He did this at Twitter. The engineers had to come in and justify to his people what they were actually doing. But that wasn't how those emails worked. We all know this, right? He doesn't have a staff capable of seriously working through and then following up on emails from some million government employees about what they did that week, and then really checking, well, did they do it well? Like, was the thing accomplished, right? Like, that's not how you do that. Like, what, he's got 50 people at Doge? Nothing. If you want to do zero-based budgeting, it has to be against a criteria. So coming in and gutting USAID, some of the things USAID does are just extraordinary, right? PEPFAR. Nobody anywhere thought PEPFAR was not an efficient program. PEPFAR is maybe the highest value thing that we have ever done in the US government to save human life through foreign aid. I mean, just bluntly, it's a George W. Bush program. It saved a generation of people from dying of HIV/AIDS. They just turned it off, and they didn't have somebody come in and justify the PEPFAR funding. They just turned it off, as they turned all these different things off, and have never given people a serious effort to come back in and say, this is what we do. They just fired half of the people at DOE. DOE is, if you look at it, DOE has the lowest staffing level of any agency, but the fourth highest appropriation, and it administers the more than $1 trillion higher ed. It is, in overhead terms, one of the leanest of all the agencies, alongside Social Security Agency. They didn't tell those people like what they wanted out of a DOE of half the size. They didn't let those people come in and argue for their jobs. They're just cutting things, and they're not explaining at any point, at any level, what they want to do with them. And then I will also say what they're doing is probably illegal, right? Just this week or last week, a judge said that about 26,000 people need to be rehired by the federal government because their firings were illegal. And now that's going to go up to the Supreme Court, and we'll see what John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett say, right? That game is not done yet. But they have Congress. I am a person who believes we needed civil service reform. Too hard to hire, too hard to fire, too hard to manage. And they could have gone to Congress. And frankly, at the beginning, Ro Khanna and a bunch of Democrats said they wanted to work with DOGE. Democrats were defeated. If you had wanted to build some amount of like political, bipartisanship, it was there to do, right? Like the Democrats voted for the Lake and Riley bill, the hardcore immigration bill. They were ready to deal. But they didn't want to do that because it is fundamentally for them about political control. And this is my stalemate case for the action. This is a case I believe. What Elon did at Twitter was not make Twitter more efficient. It's not like a better product now. It's a different product. But what he did was he made it controllable. What he did at Twitter was he went into something where he thought the people disagreed with him. And he broke it until he had actual operational control of the thing. And they would do what he wanted them to do. And then he can move it in his direction. What they're doing in the federal government, and this is what Chris Rufo wanted to do, it's what Russ Vought wanted to do, is make the thing controllable. And what they want to do with that control, I don't even think they fully know. But their view is that the federal government is like it is the capital city that they have conquered. And now they need to turn it into something that they can actually use. And in order to do that, I mean, Russ Vada said you need to traumatize the civil servants, right? That was his word, traumatize the civil servants. When, Elon Musk talked about USAID, said it's all worms, no apple. We're going to feed it to the wood chipper. This isn't the language of, let's see who's really doing a good job here and who's not. This is a language of conquering. This is the language of destruction. And they have not articulated new, better goals for it. And nor are they starting with the parts of the government where I think you would start with. Like, what do they want the education department to do? Like, I'm a professional political journalist. I talk to people in the Trump administration. I can't tell you what they want out of it, aside from the fact that they don't like it. And they think it's like a hotbed of other people's power. I can tell you what some conservatives have written about it, but the administration itself has not articulated goals. So what I think their view is right now is they're breaking the thing and trying to make the people who would be oppositional either like leave or go into hiding. And then they're going to figure out what they want to do with it. But like right now, they're in the period where you have to sack. And then like later on, you can build yourself your monuments and turn the civil service to your own ends. That is my, like, I don't think it's still, that is what I think is going on.
I think that's from a certain perspective, accurate and insightful description. If we just look at Twitter, you said that he didn't make it more efficient, he made it more controllable. Let me just describe, just because I know the engineers inside Twitter well, which we could argue that the government is very different than a company. That's an important argument there. With Twitter, the culture that's there now, people are really excited to work there and to be productive there, engineers. Elon is really good at finding people that are there, extremely good at what they do, and are there to give everything. And the resulting thing, this machine that is created, all barriers removed, you create beautiful stuff. It's not like move fast and break things. It's very cynical perspective on it. No, everybody loves what they do, are good at it, and are really rapidly figuring out all the multitude of problems that arise in that. And so it just creates it's a different culture, a culture of productivity. And it's not like some negative boys club, or there's all kinds of negative perspectives you can take on those things. No, it's a positive culture of productivity. Controllable side, also really important to understand. And that could be taken advantage of in a really negative way, especially in government. But you should say on some of the most successful software projects, there is a level of control required to, like open source projects. Linus Torvald, the head of that heads up the Linux kernel, there has to be what's often called the benevolent dictator for life. There has to be a controllability to the machine of this extremely productive, efficient team to work together. Now, those are engineering projects. And the problem with government is you get elected new benevolent dictators for life that come.
They're often not benevolent.
And they're often not benevolent. And they all convince themselves they're benevolent. I'm sure Hitler thought he's doing the right thing, the good thing, the benevolent thing in his worldview. Every single dictator does that. Yes. So that's a problem. But in order to be efficient, there has to be some level of controllability. And there has to be, I think, just to go back to the steel man, you have to have a culture of productivity that I'm not sure. I've had quite a bit of experience with DOD and DARPA from the academic side. Just everything is so bureaucratic and slow. That's a different culture. So, part of the destruction is in reestablishing a culture, and yes, make it more controllable so you can be efficient.
We still need to define what the outcome is.
Yes.
Productivity in service of what? Efficiency in service of what? And I think the juxtaposition of the private and public sectors is really useful here. Private companies, publicly traded companies, have the benefit of tight and quantifiable feedback loops. Are you making more money this quarter than you were last quarter or less? How's consumer feedback? Do people say they like the product more? Are you getting 4.8 on your reviews or 4.6? The feedback loops are very quantifiable, and they're also very, very quick. You know exactly when you're doing a good and bad job, and so the KPIs are so cleanly drawn that people are aligned in their sense of we are moving forward or moving back, right? I don't think government has done this at all under DOGE. In fact, I think in some ways, goals that you could clearly identify as being good are being torn down. And this is why, again, it's so useful to be able to articulate goals in politics, because without an articulation of goals, you don't know whether the job to be done is to take something away or to add something. And right now, the answer from DOGE is to take away, subtract everything, break down to studs, as Ezra said. But let's take a really, really concrete example here. The FDA. Right? DOGE just laid off dozens of probationary employees, so upwardly mobile, recently hired, often very young, nicely credentialed employees at the FDA as a part of its slashing of the federal workforce. One of the big problems of the FDA is slow approval of phase 3 clinical trial drugs. Right? Everyone in this country who believes in science and technology wants the most life-saving drugs to be brought into the public marketplace as soon as possible and competed against with other drugs so the price comes down and helps to extend people's lives and health spans. I think everyone agrees that that is an outcome worth fighting for. And if they don't, certainly, Ezra and I are willing to say that's an outcome that we want. That's what we want from our science policy. What happens if you cut probationary employees at the FDA? The FDA doesn't become more efficient. It becomes less efficient because the same amount of work spread over fewer people means longer delays in terms of approving phase 3 clinical trial drugs and deciding whether or not to approve them for public consumption. So in this really, really clear and very specific example, I think we can see the problem with not having articulated goals. You don't know whether the job to be done is to take away employees or to add them. I think if instead what DOGE had done is come in and say, you know what, Elon Musk and a bunch of other people from Silicon Valley, one thing we take very seriously is the importance of scientific and technological progress. Because if you look back over decades and centuries, what distinguishes our generation from every other generation in terms of its health and its power is science and technology. And we want to infuse government with a sense of science and technological progress. And to that end, one thing we want to do is to have a smarter and more efficient FDA so that people can experience life-saving medicines. I think what you would do is research the bottlenecks that exist to American science and pharmaceutical policy and say we should hire more people at the FDA to accelerate drug approval, decide which drugs are to be rejected and which drugs are to get the FDA label. That is the opposite of the DOGE approach. And this really, I think, puts a fine point to the problem of a DOGE without goals. When Elon takes over Tesla, when Elon is at SpaceX, when Elon's at X, I would imagine, and you know this better than me because you know him, and maybe most importantly, for the purposes of this part of the conversation, you know the people who work for him. I'll bet if you ask the people who work under Elon at X, Tesla, SpaceX, they say, I know exactly what Elon wants. This is his goal for the super heavy rocket. This is his goal in terms of humanoid robots. This is his goal in terms of profitability of Twitter and the growth of our subscription business and how we're going to integrate new features. There's probably a really clear mind meld. Right now, I have no sense that there's a mind meld. And in fact, I have the exact opposite sense, that rather than an example of creative destruction, which would be a mitzvah of entrepreneurship, we have an act of destruction. We have destruction for the sake of destruction. It's much cleaner to me from an interpretive standpoint to describe DOGE as an ideological purge of progressivism, performing an act of, or performing the job of efficiency, rather than a department of actual efficiency itself.
I want to say, because I really want to emphasize that it has goals. The goals are clear on some level, and they have to do with centralizing power. So let me take out something that's not DOGE, because this is, I think, an important place where you see what the effort is. What is Congress for? Not just Democrats in Congress, who are in theory right now the opposition party, but Republicans in Congress. Congress is this aggregation of information from different places in the country who've chosen representatives to represent them in Washington, right? That's how the system works. One of the things that has really cowed congressional Republicans, it is a huge, sun-like gravitational force now on Capitol Hill, is that Elon has made it known that any House or Senate Republican who defies Trump on a key vote, cabinet nominees, the CR, that kind of thing, he will dump $50 to $100 million into a primary. It's no money at all for him. It's lethal for them, right? This is well known. He has said this like personally to some of them, right? It's been well reported. This is probably why Jody Ernst voted for Pete Hegseth. Well, what's achieved by this? I think it's like an interesting question because Republicans in theory are allied to Donald Trump, right? He's the nominee of their party, and they don't have like literally the same view of him. But I think you might say from one perspective, there is a value in the system in there being checks and balances. There's a value in the system having to absorb other kinds of information. Now, we already don't have the checks and balances we once had or thought we would have in this country because we have nationalized political parties instead of, branches of government that sort of compete, with ambition checking ambition. And I've done whole shows on this, and we can talk about that if we want. But we do have political parties, and political parties are themselves institutions that aggregate different kinds of information in order to try to come to some outcome that is a better outcome because more information is surfaced. I think Donald Trump would be in a stronger position for him if Senate Republicans could have done what they actually wanted to do and not confirm RFK Jr., not confirm Tulsi Gabbard, not confirm Pete Hegseth, not confirm Kash Patel and Don Bongino, right? That's actually a huge amount of risk the Trump administration has taken on. If they had named a sort of normal figure to HHS, and then there's a measles outbreak, well, measles outbreaks are tough. Like, that's a hard thing. If you name RFK Jr. and there's a huge measles outbreak, you're really going to get blamed for that because people are ready to blame you. If there is a domestic terror attack after you've put Kash Patel, who's quite unqualified, in charge of the FBI, and they've sort of launched a war internally against the FBI, which they see as a hotbed of anti-Trump sentiment, and the FBI in the sort of internal chaos misses some things, and you have deaths on American soil, that's a huge amount of risk you've taken on. I mean, the guy they fired, Chris Wray, he was Trump's appointee. It wasn't some Democrat. Trump named him in his first term. But Elon, right, what he did here was he created a kind of Death Star of primary money. And he has said that, like, if you cross Trump in Congress, even as a Republican, you're done. Like, between Trump's control of attention and loyalty and my ability to outspend you, like, you're toast. I think what that reveals is that what he wants is for power to be centralized under Trump. We've been talking about the bureaucracy, but he also wants it to be true in Congress. I am not a Donald Trump fan, but obviously other people are Donald Trump fans, right? Obviously, I think at this point, Elon Musk is a Donald Trump fan, but much of the country thinks this guy is great. And I think we should take what they are doing at word and deed. The point of Donald Trump is that Donald Trump is right about things. We should give him power and he should use that power. My sense is you have some mixed feelings about him, but not everybody does. And this sort of very consistent application of authority across the people he's named. J.D. Vance, the difference between Mike Pence and J.D. Vance is J.D. Vance said explicitly in the whole run-up to the vice presidential sweepstakes that his view of what went wrong in the first administration is between the bureaucracy and the staff, too many people were trying to inhibit Donald Trump. And that what he would do is tell Trump that, like, he's got to get rid of these generals and he's got to get people who will do what Trump actually said. The view of Trump's fans, the view of his allies, is that the first term didn't go well enough because they had too much opposition from Republicans in Congress who talked Trump into things they shouldn't have talked him into, and too much opposition from the civil service and even from Trump's own staff. I think a very simple heuristic of why these terms are so different is that the most important member of the Trump family, Trump aside, in the first term was Jared Kushner and maybe Ivanka. And the most important member of the family in the second is Don Trump Jr., right? Kushner brought in a bunch of inhibitors. He brought in mainstream figures like Gary Cohn and Kushner represented other parts of society that, were sort of mixed on Trump, and they wanted him to do certain things and not others. And there was maybe a productive tension. McConnell, was majority leader. He was more powerful than Thune is. Paul Ryan was speaker. He's more powerful than Mike Johnson is. In the second term, you have Don Trump Jr., who brings in much more right-wing figures, they're accelerators, not inhibitors, accelerationists in many cases explicitly. You have Elon Musk, who believes like the likeliest problem is Trump doesn't go far enough, fast enough. And you have a weak Republican Congress that is further cowed by Musk's money. It could be good or it could be bad, but the Curtis Yarvin take that we need a more monarch-like figure is clearly being tested out. Like the view, just as you said, about software engineering things is that you often need a benevolent dictator. Now, I don't think Trump is benevolent. Other people do. But the view that what is being attempted here is something much more centralized in its power, I think is actually a shared view of what's going on. It's like a consensus reality we have, not like an argument over reality we're having.
Do you think there's some degree to where if you trust in the system of democracy, which I do, and there's some people, and we'll talk about them, who one of the main criticisms and concerns of Donald Trump was he's going to break democracy. But if you trust that democracy holds, isn't this an interesting experiment of how, when everybody's aligned, aggressive cutting of regulation and the number of people is an experiment of like, okay, let's see what this does to a really over-bloated bureaucracy that's become extremely inefficient. And by the way, so I have an optimism about it that matches the vision of abundance in the book. That once you do the creative destruction, then you start to really be able to step in and have a clear vision of like, okay, housing. What are the policies to solve housing? But I do think the first step that's needed is the destruction.
As Ezra said, we're sort of speed running a particular experiment here.
Yeah.
Of what does executive power look like if we do away as much as possible with checks and balances? And I would submit that we're already starting to get some feedback loops from the market. The stock market is not the economy, but it is a very clear voting mechanism. And what's clear is that many institutional and retail investors think that the current economic regime is pushing us toward a recession that we don't have to have. Right? Donald Trump has insulated himself from any feedback loop or any sense of criticism that his tariff policy might not be the best course of strategy for American industry or global relations. And as a result, what we have is, I think, fairly described as a kind of purposeful chaos. I mean, what other term can you use if a tariff is being announced at 9 a.m. and then taken away at 3:30 p.m. and then 10 days later announced at 9:37 and then renegotiated at 2:45? This is not a principled theory of the perfect tariff level on international trade. This is, I think, much more parsimoniously explained by just an expression of Donald Trump's personality. This is a New York real estate guy. He loves making big, awesome pronouncements and then using those big, awesome pronouncements in order to negotiate little one-on-one dealings where he can wrest for himself a personal sense of power or money or pride, right? Announcing these tariffs in a sort of chaotic way forces world leaders to get on the phone with him and say, Donald, what can I give you to bring down the tariff, right? This is personality standing in for politics in a way that's totally unmolested by anybody else's sense of, hey, that'll maybe chill it on the tariff policy. Hey, let's maybe slow down on the deportations. I'm not so sure about this particular move over here. Instead, you have an executive branch that's just a full manifestation of Donald Trump's mind. And I do think that the early returns, if you look at consumer sentiment, if you look at the stock market, if you look at the 10-year yield, you have a range of, let's call them, aggregated economic information telling us that the economy, consumers, employers, investors do not like what's happening now, which is going to be a really interesting test case. Donald Trump's first 4 years in office, right? Love him or hate him, were 4 rather successful years of economic growth. Low unemployment, steady growth, low inflation, pretty much every economic indicator in the green. We're already in the red in many of the economic indicators that never even blinked yellow under his first administration. And I personally don't think it's a coincidence that you're getting these red indicators at a time when Donald Trump is having an entirely different experience of being president, where there is no Mnuchin to tell him, hey, maybe let's cool it off on the tariffs. The one more thing I would add here is you said, maybe Trump's presidency is a kind of right-wing abundance. Right. And I think it's a worthy question, right? Is Donald Trump just doing his own version of abundance? And we should, even if we disagree with his process ideologically, sort of root for the outcomes that are likely under it. Here's why I don't think so. Let's say that you, or just someone as a conservative, shares our view that they want housing to be abundant. I think what they should really root for is to reduce the tax for building and make it easier to add housing units cheaply. Well, houses are made out of materials. 2 of the most important materials in home building are soft lumber and drywall. Soft lumber we import from Canada. Drywall, one of the key ingredients, we import from Mexico. One of the first things that's going to happen if you raise a 25% tariff on lumber from Canada and drywall from Mexico is that the cost of housing is going to go straight up. And this isn't my personal opinion. This was a March 7th memo sent by the National Association of Home Builders, essentially in a kind of controlled panic saying, please don't do a tariff policy like this. You're going to screw over home builders, even though, ironically, you, Donald Trump, were elected by Biden to Trump voters who were mad about the price of housing. So I am not, in the moment, optimistic that his centralizing style is going to be economically useful for Americans, whatever their interests. My sense of the early feedback and of the early returns is that he, in fact, does not have a very clear and beneficial economic agenda. He has a personal agenda. He likes taking phone calls from international leaders and working out little deals with them. I don't think that's in the larger interest of economic growth. And certainly I don't think it's in the specific interest of reducing housing prices.
Okay, there's a lot to say there. So first of all, can we separate the sort of abundance and DOGE, those efforts, from tariffs? Because I don't know who agrees with the tariffs. The tariffs don't make sense to me economically. Maybe you can explain who agrees or likes the tariffs on the right or the left,
but
or anybody.
You see my point that...
Well, that point also, to comment on it, I mean, one of the mechanisms by which bureaucracy forms is a kind of polite civility and a structure and a process. There is an argument to be made, and I'm not saying Donald Trump is that person, but there's some qualities there of picking up the phone and calling Putin. That goes against all the process. Some of the most successful peace negotiations throughout history broke process. It's just spoke with Narendra Modi. There's a process. You're not supposed to meet with Pakistan or whatever for India. You just screw it. I'm going to go to a Pakistan wedding of a high up official. I'm going to do these things that are very Trumpian, break the rules. Okay. Now that, in a perfect world, some of that is good, matched with principled policy that's surrounded by a large number of experts that actually understand that policy. Okay, I can criticize Trump all day, but I'm just saying that there is some degree to the picking up the phone and talking to leaders and playing in the morning say one thing, in the evening another, that could be part of a principled chaos.
I think the important part of madman theory is that you're not actually a madman. You just got to convince people you are.
Yes.
Look, I don't think I am in agreement that we should talk to everybody. I don't know how many people followed the 2008 election closely who are watching this. There's a big fight in that election between Clinton and Obama about should you negotiate with your enemies. And Obama's view is we should talk to anybody. And Clinton's view was more nuanced than that, right? Certainly we shouldn't at this juncture. And during his presidency, Obama did a deal with Iran on the nuclear question. He negotiated with Cuba, right? He had very direct negotiations with Russia. He did it, importantly, unlike Donald Trump, without alienating all of our traditional allies. One of the things that I think is important to say about Trump is that the difference between Trump and, say, Biden or Trump and Obama is not that Trump will negotiate with Putin and Obama wouldn't. It's that Trump is realigning our alliances. He doesn't really seem to want to negotiate with the Europeans, or at least he wants to do it from a more hostile position. He wants to make Canada the 51st state, not treat it as a longtime ally. The thing here is not that Trump is negotiating with our perceived enemies. These are his perceived allies, and he's turning our traditional allies into perceived enemies. So with him, I think it's important. Like, I am very much on the view of you talk to everybody. And it was my view going back, for some years that it was clear that the Biden administration needed to be pushing for negotiations over Ukraine. There was not going to be some end game here where Ukraine got all of its territory back. But I don't think it is reasonable to look at what he is doing and say that is the norm that he has broken. The idea that we should have negotiations. I mean, many different presidents have done many surprising things, and he's rolled back a bunch of those things. Republicans have been very unfriendly to the opening that began with Cuba, right? And that was like a big deal in American foreign policy, something Obama did against very heavy criticism, something that cost him and cost Democrats in Florida and among Cuban voters in the following election. So I just don't think that that's that unusual of a thing with Trump. I also just want to say with the tariffs, you sort of wanted to cut the tariffs off from DOGE and cut the tariffs off from this broader agenda. And one reason I don't is that I think the way to understand tariffs, look, you can be accomplishing many different things with tariffs. One thing, which was a theory that you heard from some people around Trump and sort of fit what he said on the campaign trail, which was Trump's position on the campaign trail, was that he was going to lay down 10 to 20% tariffs on all imported goods and 65% tariffs on imported goods from China. So I think it's a bad idea for a bunch of different reasons. But what that is a stable change in the cost structure for all corporations and all trade. And then different players can make different investment decisions in the long term based on this new cost structure. What he's doing, as Derek said, and I've had these funny experiences where I'm literally doing a podcast with a tariffs expert, and I'll be talking about like the auto parts problem. And then my producer will be like, he just, delayed the tariff on the auto parts. What he's doing with these tariffs that you move on and you move off and you negotiate over endlessly, and I've been told this again by people around him, is their view is that America had leverage it wasn't using. And tariffs in particular are a form of executive control. Trade deals need to be negotiated and ratified with Congress. Trade deals are something you have to do with the rest of the system. But tariffs are something Trump can do unilaterally. And one thing Trump wants is control. That is the through line of virtually everything in his politics. Tariffs are a leverage-based form of foreign policy. America has the biggest economy in the world, that anybody who's going to get into a trade war with us is going to suffer worse than we will. And there's something where the president can use the tariffs because of authority granted by Congress some time ago for other purposes. He can use them with a huge amount of discretion. So you can use them on the one hand to say, well, I think that we've lost too much manufacturing and the dollar is undervalued in other places, and so, or overvalued rather. And so we want to use tariffs to make the cost structure differently so that people have to locate more of the supply chains and the intermediate manufacturing in the United States. But you can also use a tariff to say Colombia has to take the people we're deporting and they have to take them in chains. Right. And Donald Trump is doing both things. And the reason I think it's important to keep those in mind is that what Donald Trump wants, what connects a lot of different things, is that he wants leverage over things. I think it connects to Eric Adams. And you were sitting here talking in New York City. Eric Adams is a Democratic mayor, right? Donald Trump is no truck with Eric Adams, right? He did not support Eric Adams. Eric Adams is not his natural ally. But what he had over Eric Adams, he realized was a leverage. That he could get the cases off of Eric Adams and then get Eric Adams in his pocket. So Donald Trump stepped in to save the corrupt Democratic mayor of New York City. Not because they have a deep ideological alliance, but because then Donald Trump would have power over New York City and its policy that he wouldn't otherwise have. The thing that connects Trump is a very old school politician. He's very relational. He's very 19th century. He's looking for the angle. He's very zero sum. He's looking for things that give him power. DOGE is a way of getting power over the bureaucracy. Tariffs are a way of getting power over the international financial system and foreign policy and breaking sort of traditional alliances. Maybe in his mind, even getting Canada to become the 51st state, maybe getting Mexico to change its immigration policy, trying to weaponize the Justice Department against Eric Adams as a way of getting power over a Democratic mayor. Some of what they're doing with grants and money is a way of getting power over sort of other institutions in American life. Again, you could think it's bad or you could think it's good. But it is coherent, right? I think it's bad, but it is coherent. And the people who think it's good for Trump to have power. Again, with the Eric Adams thing, they were very explicit about this, right? They said that it is worthwhile for the president to negotiate over his policy objectives and to trade things to get his policy objectives more fully carried out. And so Eric Adams went from saying New York City would be a sanctuary city to they'd aggressively carry out deportations. You can think that kind of transactionalism is fine. I think in this case, given that it's about corruption, it wasn't. But the idea, Trump's idea, that the problem is that the president doesn't wield enough power here the way he does in Russia, the way he might in India, the way he might in China. Trump has spoken very openly of envying some of the powers these other people have. I think it's a consistent governing philosophy that needs to be taken as that, right? I think sometimes you describe one of the difficulties Trump poses is sometimes if you just describe what he's doing, I think quite neutrally, people say, oh, you're criticizing him, you're anti-Trump. But I'm just describing what he's doing. You can think it's good or it's bad, but like the fact that he wants to arrogate power and find points of leverage, and tariffs are one, what he's doing through DOGE is another, what he did with the DOJ is another. It's all very consistent. The question is really then just whether or not what your normative view is on Trump having that much power.
Yeah, I have a question about DOGE, but before that, I'll just say that I don't think Donald Trump should have that much power, because I think to this day my biggest criticism and concern is that he is a person that denied the results of the election. And so I'm unwilling, I like George Washington. I like people that have the skill, the ability, the track record to walk away from power. And a person who's unwilling to accept reality and is willing to bend reality to maintain a grip on power, even if what they're trying to do is really good, maybe making a government more efficient, makes me very concerned. But on the topic of Doge, is more on the Elon side. If we can sort of combine Doge and abundance as a topic, if Doge succeeds, the effort, let's just forget Doge, but the effort of making government more efficient, what does that look like before the next election and after the next election? If we can just look at success.
I know I'm jumping in again, but I'll do something quick and then pass to you. I'm not a huge fan of the experiment framing, because amidst this experiment, people are, through USAID, as my colleague Nick Kristof has documented, and potentially further in other ways will die, lose homes, be scammed by things. So I feel like experimenting with the government at that level is very dangerous. But if, assuming democracy survives, Democrats, if they are going to make the government work again, are going to have to become less rule-bound than they were. I have this line that the problem with the personality type of the right is it's autocratic now, and the problem with the personality type of the left is it's bureaucratic. And I don't want to see things going either to where Doge is in terms of, I think there's a fundamental lawlessness to it, but I also don't like the aims of it. But I don't want to see things where Democrats were, which is such which is such respect for process, that they will put the process ahead of getting their own things done. They will listen to any lawyer with any super intense interpretation of any law, and that'll turn them all the way back. What Doge has demonstrated is that the room for movement inside the American government, inside the state, is much wider than anybody gave it credit for, both Republican and Democratic administrations. It may not be as wide. It probably isn't legally as wide as what Doge is trying to do, and that's why they're losing all these court cases. But it is wide, and you could also use Congress, right? You could pass statute to make it wider, and you should. There is no abundance agenda that works if the Democratic Party is as rule-bound and as process-obsessed as it was in the last 10 years. It doesn't work flatly, right? That is why so many of the stories we tell in the book are about process gone, it's not process gone wrong because it's doing exactly what it was intended to do, but it is process that has become antagonistic to the promised outcomes. And so I do hope there's a kind of, thesis, right? All the institutions are great. Democrats are the defenders of government. Antithesis: the government is a corrupt cesspool. It's a ball of worms, and it has to be destroyed and taken over by a benevolent or non-benevolent dictator. And synthesis, which is that the government's process has made it not a functional state. It's non-responsive in many important ways. And it needs to be reformed at a quite fundamental level, but in a way that is lawful, in a way that is thoughtful, in a way that is running experiments, it gathers information and then can make adjustments, in a way that is respectful of the human lives that it touches and affects, in a way that is not hostile to the goals of good government, but is more committed to them than it is committed to the process the government has erected and evolved over time.
Ezra articulated the principle beautifully, and just to put some meat on the bones, abundance is about being incredibly concrete about what you want to accomplish in the world. Then it's about understanding how to accomplish that. A stage of the process that I think Doge has entirely skipped. I don't think we've reached the stage of understanding. We've destroyed, and then maybe it's sometimes promised to understand the thing that we've destroyed after the fact. You want to set goals, you want to understand how to meet those goals, and then you want to meet them. And the problem with liberalism of the last few years and the last few decades is that we've become disconnected from outcomes. Really, really crystal clear example. So Joe Biden in 2021 signs the bipartisan infrastructure law. And he and Pete Buttigieg call it, truthfully, one of the most important infrastructure bills passed in the last few decades. $1.2 trillion to do exactly what Ezra and I want to do, to build in the world. There's a piece of that law that's a $42 billion program called BEAD, which stands for Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, I think. $42 billion to build rural broadband. Fast forward to 2024, practically none of it is built. We're now 4 calendar years after it was passed, and the program is, at this point, it seems like it's going to die, and they're just going to transfer the whole thing to Starlink. So why? Right? We want to understand. Why does government fail to achieve its outcomes? And how can we learn from those failures to allow government to succeed at its outcomes? Well, you look into it, and it turns out that in order to take these $42 billion and send it to the states had to go through a 14-stage process in order to get the money. First, the FCC had to draw a map of the places where America needed more rural broadband. And then there was a challenge period where people could question the map. And the FCC would remake the map, and then the challengers would sue them to change the map again.
Yeah.
Then the states had to file a letter of intent and a 5-year action plan and a funding program, all of which could be subject to their own challenge periods. And in each of these challenge periods, the Commerce Department is going back to the states and saying, we really like your 5-year plan, but your workforce development program didn't pass this matrix of equity, and you didn't reach out to the right bidders over here. And if you try harder to reach out to more people who just aren't white men to be your employees, that would be fantastic if you could put that into the new edit that you submit to us. And of course, there are delays because every state has to do its own programs. The Commerce Department is backed up, yada, yada, yada. You get to a point where out of 56 states and jurisdictions that have applied to begin the 14-stage process, by the time the Democrats lose the election in November 2024, 3 out of the 56 have passed all 14 stages, and very little of the money has actually been spent because of all the problems that Ezra and I have discussed about how hard it is to build in the physical world. $42 billion, therefore, dies upon contact with planet Earth. That's not government achieving its goals. And a DOGE that we were sort of, duumvirates of in this parallel universe is one that would try very clearly to A, articulate a goal. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to build rural broadband. Why? Because we think connectivity is incredibly important to the economy of the future. It helps people's health. It helps the economy of rural areas. Let's build rural broadband. 2, what are the roadblocks? What are the bottlenecks? What's hard about taking a pot of money that exists in Washington and actually creating broadband networks in rural Kentucky? Let's understand what those roadblocks are so that we can do 2 things. We can take away the things that need to be taken away to accelerate the program, and maybe we can add new policies that will accelerate the spending, because bottom line, we want to make a difference in the world. That's a world where government is, to borrow Ezra's language, deregulated itself. It's easier for the government to achieve its goals. I think that it's really important at the level of sort of principle here that liberals fall out of love with this procedural fetish that has dominated the left over the last half century and fall back in love with outcomes, to be ruthlessly obsessed with how liberalism has failed and how these kind of failures aren't just technocratic stories to tell in a podcast. I think this is fundamental to why Democrats are losing the communications war in an era of anti-establishment and anti-institution. We find ourselves in the reflexive position of having all the cranks, so to speak, having left the Democratic Party, and we're the ones who defend all institutions. We're the ones who defend the establishments. We're the ones saying government can only do good. But as a result, we lose the ability to talk to people about how government fails and how they can see that failure, and how sometimes they're literally leaving cities and states run by Democrats because that failure is so effing obvious to them. So this isn't just about the BEAD program. It's not just about 14-step programs. It's not just about rural broadband. It really is about a higher level principle of political communication. How do you develop a liberalism that in an age of anti-establishment anger both reflects that anger and channels it for proactive purposes by not just doing destruction, but creative destruction?
So first of all, beautifully put, and second, sort of the big thing that Doge did is make this a sexy topic to discuss, and then you can tear down Doge with the way they're doing it, say it's wrong, criticize, but then people are all of a sudden more and more caring about the efficiency of government and educating themselves, learning about it, and it's creating a culture of transparency to the whole thing. So now you can swoop in with a book like Abundance and like describe, here's how to do actually, how to have a clear mission and metrics, how to solve these problems. But like that allows, it's supposed to have this culture of process, Me personally, one of the things that really frustrates me about this world is that the bureaucracy of that kind of process, especially because everybody, at least in the United States, is just all so fucking polite everywhere about the whole thing. They're all so nice to you as they're doing the process. About every single thing. They're just like, and then you have to call from 9 to 5. There's hours, and let's schedule a meeting in 3 weeks from now to discuss this document so we can have another document. And all of a sudden, the big dreams and the visions, the hopes that people have invested in building a project that's an incredible project dies. It's not just the waste of money. It's the possibility of a beautiful thing that could have been built never gets built.
You're retracing Ezra's lovely line about how the character of the right these days is autocratic and the character of the left can be overly bureaucratic. I hope there's a middle synthesis lane here where there's a political identity that believes in efficient bureaucracies. Sometimes it actually does take a lot of people to get certain things done.
Yes, yeah.
But you really, I think, need to have an eye toward institutional reform. This is a theme of our book that we haven't talked about as much yet, but I think it's so important for abundance to believe that each generation is passed down institutions that were created for different eras, different decades, to solve different problems, right? That's how you get an environmental revolution in the 1960s that solves the problem of clean or dirty air and dirty water, but leaves us with a set of norms like NEPA that make it impossible to add clean energy in our generation. Just a tragedy of unintended outcomes. And to narrow this down to a world that I know you care a lot about, there's a chapter in our book about science policy and the history of the NIH. And the NIH really comes into its own after World War II. And it is immediately this beautifully funded crown jewel of biomedical research, just the federal government irrigating university researchers studying cancer and heart disease and brain science and everything else. I mean, practically every single scientific breakthrough in the US in the last 70 years bears the fingerprints of NIH. But the NIH is also a bureaucracy. And like every bureaucracy, it has accumulated a set of processes and habits that the people most affected by it, scientists in America, told us and will tell anybody else who's listening, has flaws. According to some surveys, 40% of the time that scientists are working today in America, they are filling out grants and doing paperwork, not doing science. That is astonishing. I mean, as we say in the book, imagine if we discovered that one year there was a virus that broke out in the American academic scene, such that our scientists suffered from chronic fatigue disorder between January and June every single year. They just couldn't work. We'd be like, this is an absolute shonda. We have to fix this problem. This problem exists. It's our own bureaucratic rules. It's the rules that we wrote that's slowing down science. So what should we do? I don't think we should tear down the NIH. I don't think we should slash and burn grants as we're currently doing in the administration. I think we should understand what's broken and be clear about our desired outcomes. My desired outcome for science is that we produce and pursue high-risk, high-reward science under the theory that almost no important breakthrough is going to be obvious before you discovered it. If it's obvious, you probably already knew it, so why is it some new science? You should want to incentivize scientists to ask their biggest, most curious questions in a high-risk, high-reward environment. And right now, the NIH doesn't do that. The NIH, for a variety of reasons, whether it's aspects of the peer review process or just assumptions that scientists have of the system, is too incrementalist. It funds older researchers, and it wastes a lot of scientists' time with bureaucratic paperwork and kludge. We'd love to reform it. We have ideas for reforming it. But if liberals don't use the language of and act on institutional reform, we will allow institutions to grow old and sclerotic and piss off Americans, and they'll vote for people who come in with a wrecking ball to tear it down, right? So that's why I think it's so important for abundance liberals like us to be very clear about our goals, our outcomes, and exactly what we want to accomplish, because I think that's the only way to really see how and why institutions that are all around us truly do need reform.
Listen, I hope your book becomes the manifesto of the Democratic Party. It's a beautiful vision. I'm a little bit skeptical because of the momentum of bureaucratic thought, but I'm nevertheless remain hopeful.